started. On behalf of the Rethinking Economics India Network, I would like to welcome you all to the second session of our 2-day webinar series on the informal labor economy in India. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I would just like to give you a brief introduction to Rethinking Economics India. We are the national network of the Rethinking Economics global movement, and we're working towards making economics more pluralist, inclusive, and diverse in India. We had the first session of our event yesterday, where we discussed informal livelihoods and the gig economy with Dr. Amit Vasole and Dr. Nupur Rawal. It was a rather insightful discussion where we were not only able to identify gaps that lie within the discipline of economics, and the different economic paradigms and frameworks that have failed to to tackle the challenges of informal economy, but we were also able to understand what needs to change in terms of the labor laws and policies. And today we're going to further the discussion and we'll discuss the very pertinent issue of inclusivity in the informal economy. We will look at it from the lens of gender inequalities and mental health. As we all know that within the informal economy, marginalized genders have disproportionately borne the brunt of the issues that informal economy faces at large. And this is an issue that needs to be tackled. And we will also be talking about mental health. Mental health, as it is in India, especially, is still unfortunately treated as a stigma. And mental health of the informal laborer is a conversation that is almost non existent. So we believe it is very important to stir forth a conversation on these two topics. And with us, we have two eminent speakers who are experts in the field. We have Dr. Ritu Devan, who is the Vice President of the Indian Society of Labor Economics, visiting professor at the Institute of Human Development, executive editor at the leaflet.in, trustee of the India Forum. And from 2014 to 2017, she was the president of the Indian Association for Women's Studies. She was, till her retirement, the first ever woman director of the Department of Economics, University of Mumbai, and the founder member of the first Center for Economics in Asia. Thank you, Dr. Ritu Devan, for joining us. We also have Dr. Bhargavi Davar, who is a noted mental health activist in India. She is managing director of the Bapu Trust for research on mind and discourse. She's also convener for an Asia Pacific advocacy platform called Transforming Communities in Inclusion, Asia. Her work through these organizations is to advocate for the full realization of all human rights for persons with psychosocial disabilities, especially the right to live in the community. She completed her PhD in philosophy of psychology from Indian Institute of Technology, Mumbai. Thank you, Dr. Bhargavi Davar, for joining us. We're very happy to have the both of you with us today for this very, very pertinent session. So before we get started, just some housekeeping rules. As I've already mentioned, please do introduce yourselves in the chat. We would love to know where you're from, and which university or organization you're affiliated with. And if you have any questions, please do post them in the Q&A tab. We would be taking them up towards the end of the session, where we have dedicated half an hour for the Q&A. So let's get started with Dr. Devan, who will be discussing gender inequalities in the informal economy. And she would particularly throw light on it with respect to the pandemic and give us policy responses for the same. Dr. Devan.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me because there's some sound issue. Yeah. Thank you so much for organizing this. And I think just setting up an organization called Rethinking Economics. I mean, that's something a lot of us have been saying for a very long period of time. And understanding that economics is beyond numbers and equations. It's an entire philosophy and, of course, a method of analysis. So keeping that in mind, the issue today is something which is very, very important. It works both ways. The context of inclusivity in the informal labor sector. Now, this particular context, there has to be a certain historical location there, and I'm not getting into this over a very, very long period of time, but just in the context of where the informal sector really stands today. Now, there's a lot of data which is there on numbers, and that, it used to be about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, before liberalization of the neoliberal paradigm came into being. It was about 82 to 84% of the working population in India was part of the informal sector. But it has been increasing very dramatically over the past maybe 2 decades, and very much so in the last, I think, 5 or 6 years, or maybe 4 years. And that is primarily, I think, linked to the entire issue of, when we talk about the informal sector today, located in a very specific context before the pandemic. Okay, it's very short period. So what did we see then? We saw declining growth, your GDP which was coming down, employment levels which were declining very dramatically already, a decrease in consumption expenditure. That is something which was, came for the first time in a very long period of time. You're increasing inequality, and for the first time in 40 years, you actually had an increase in the percentage. Forget about the absolute numbers, the relative population below the poverty line. And of course, your poverty line of a pathetic, 37 rupees and 29 rupees, that is a different kind of a debate. So earlier I used to always say, let's not romanticize the past, let's not demonize the present, but I think the time has come to really demonize the present. And what the pandemic has done to the labor market, which was already problematic, particularly the informal labor market. Here, I just want to make it very clear, it's not so much the pandemic as the policy response to the pandemic, and the utter lack of concern, of sensitivity, of any kind of I think, understanding of the lived reality of the majority of the people in our country. There is no way that you can give, 4 days to light lamps and plan your thali, and give 4 hours to close an entire huge country with a massive working population where one-third are migrants. I think this it has, and of course, your so-called relief packages, which were not really relief packages, they were all state of hand because it was part of the earlier budget. That requires a separate kind of discussion. Also, therefore, I would say, keeping in mind the inclusivity or the lack of inclusivity, I'll go into the different kinds of connotations which exist. That, to use terms like social distancing is just not done. We are already socially distanced in terms of gender and caste and community, and these divides and distancing has been there for quite some time, particularly in the last few years. So therefore, what this pandemic or the pandemic policy has done is really to reinforce the divide at all levels, whether it's formal and informal, whether it is gender, whether it is in terms of caste, of community, and this manifests itself in many different kinds of ways. Now, the informal sector, which has increased very much in the last 4 years, okay, just before the pandemic came, of course, like I said, you had your employment decline, work participation rates, etc., which were falling. But there were two economic policies which increased the informal sector. One was demonetization, okay, on which some work has been done, but I think if you see the RBI data itself, that shows you very, very clearly in terms of the kind of non-impact which it has had. And the second is the logic of implementation of the GST. Right now, a GST by definition means one tax. And the way it has been imposed, or the kinds of different levels of taxes. So you had, 12% tax on sanitary napkins. I mean, this is something which we took up as a campaign and got it removed. You had several 5%, 7%, 8% on different kinds of cereals and pulses, which is what the majority of the poor eat. But at the same point of time, if you see the GST on diamonds, I mean, this is absolutely, there's no logic to this. It's 0.25%. So really, where does the, in a way, you can, I think this manifests itself at the clearest level of political economy, of what has been happening of the entire growth pattern and the growth paradigm. What the policy has done or the lack of a policy, whichever way one may say, is that it has not only decreased wages, it has actually led to no wages at all. The first logic of any kind of a pandemic policy, which is what the majority of the countries have done, India is, I think, one of the two or three which has not implemented it, is to give a wage subsidy. Now, there is no wage subsidy. What was done was platitudes and wishful thinking and statements like employers should pay their employees, etc. Now, two things here. One is with the collapse of the economy and the lockdown. I won't say lockdown, it's really a lockup. It's what Kashmir has been going through for the last more than 1 year, is the fact that a large number of the government, a large number of MSMEs have closed down. Own account workers are out of work right now, but there's no kind of a financial support which has been given to them. And platitudes really don't work because things start from the top. So if you are asking people to pay their employees, the employers themselves are out of business, so they do not have the money to pay the employees. And when I say it starts from the top, the government itself, most of the state governments and the center, of course, has not paid its ASHA workers, has not paid doctors, has not paid nurses for the past 4 to 5 months. And in fact, this is the time when really, they should be getting much more than what was even due to them. There are also several other kinds of impacts I think we really need to take into account too. When we talk of inclusivity and in, uh, inclusion at a lower level of equality, I think that is the way really we have to see it. The numbers will increase, but the differentiations within the informal sector itself are increasing. It's not only going to, but I think it's going to probably get worse in the future. So you have an increase in numbers, certainly with the closure of MSMEs, the closure of SHGs. There are a large number of self-help groups, which is what your own account workers or, it was touted as one of the most important policies where India followed. So a large number of women were able to depend on their own earnings at whatever minimal level they could manage. So those closed down. So you
Professor,
have,
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
yeah.
Really sorry to interrupt you, but we have been getting audience feedback that they are not able to hear you very well.
Oh,
Uh,
why didn't you say
some sort
that?
of background buzzing noise.
I'm sorry. Is that better?
Yes, that's incredibly better. Thank you so much.
Sorry, sorry. Uh, I hope I don't have to repeat.
No, that would be that's okay.
Yeah, so I was talking about the issue of inclusivity. So, what really do we mean by inclusivity? Is it in the context of what we call inclusion in a broader social context or an economic context of the term, or do we see it as a inclusion at declining levels and declining inequalities and declining, I think, ethical economics and ethical economic policies? So you have, of course, an increase in informalization, which did exist. There is, it's increasing in the sense that those who were own account workers or had their own little, shops and vendors and hand cart workers, that they're now joining the, for when there was some kind of a recognition earlier of their activity, that has gone down totally. So you have those who were, I don't want to use this phrase because I think it's utterly contradictory to what is happening. But the term Atmanirbhar, it's really become like a swear word these days, because you cannot, your economic logic tells you cannot be Atmanirbhar or self-reliant and at the same time plead and beg for foreign direct investment. It's a total contradiction in terms. So the number of people in the informal sector increased from, those who were self-employed, own account, and also, of course, those who've been thrown out from the formal sector. There is no official data, as we know. There's no data on many issues,
But there are other several organizations, NGOs, etc., which have been collecting. And a large number of those who have been thrown out of the formal sector, including regular salaried work at different levels, not only the poor, but also the lower middle class, and at some level, the middle class. And therefore, the numbers in the informal sector are actually increasing. Now, what happens when you are entering the informal sector in today's context? And that is where inclusivity, in a way, has to be seen from the perspective of inequality, and in a way, a double edge or a double definition kind of a context. So, therefore, you join the informal sector because you're thrown out of formal, or you're thrown out of own employment, or whatever it is. But when you enter the informal sector today, the kind of issues which are faced by people, is is really, I think, it's just not acceptable at any human kind of a level. What you have now, just to give you two or three examples, one is a huge increase in wage differentials. And these wage differentials are not based only on gender. All right. Of course, women getting much less. I just want to give you an example of Mumbai. Now, we know even in demonetization, there were skilled workers like carpenters, etc., who were forced to do manual scavenging in Bombay, in Mumbai. For the first time, we had a woman doing manual scavenging. And she had a small little BD shop or whatever, which of course was closed down. Now, when she became a manual scavenger, the male manual scavenger for the same job was getting 400, and the female manual scavenger doing exactly the same kind of a work getting 300 rupees. So, even at the lowest level of a socio-economic employment structure or a base, you have these gender differentials which are actually increasing. There are reports in Bihar, in UP, in Orissa, and in Jharkhand that women are now working for 10 hours at 15 rupees. 15 rupees for 10 hours of work. There is also, and this is something I think which is really very tragic. I don't know what other word to use for this, is that now girls, and particularly young girls, teenage girls, are selling their bodies for rupees 10. The inequalities at many levels. There is, of course, gendered, like I said. There is the inequality between uh, so-called male-female worker, but also amongst where transgenders are concerned. I think transgenders and sex workers are two categories which are probably the worst affected of the lot. And this is done even where the relief work is concerned. I've been involved with organizing whatever relief fund could for, for migrant workers, setting up camps, etc., etc. And there were some organizations, so-called, good organizations wanting to give food, clubs, etc., of the upper class or whatever. And they said, we will not give it to transgenders, and we will not give food and ration to sex workers. I cannot understand this kind of attitude. I think it reflects a whole lot of political thinking which is going on, or political changes which are going on at the national level. There is also an increase, and this is something which had started some time back, but which I'm very sorry to say has increased very much so, is wage differentials based on religion. It's always, I found that even whenever I was working on construction workers or domestic workers, etc., I found that those from the minority community, whether it's Dalits or particularly Muslims, that they were getting lower wages in any case. Now it's not even the issue of getting lower wages, they are not getting employment. I mean, the first thing when somebody asks is, now if you employ, it's someone, it's like, what's your religion and what's your caste? And this is something which I don't know how to relate it to the context of inclusivity in the informal sector. There is also a hugely worrying trend, and that is the very sharp increase in child labor. Now here, when I say children, the feminist methodology and the broader level of economics, what we talk about, that how do we really see children? And this is something I've been working on for a period of time. And let's not see children as children. We are seeing, I think, a proper economic perspective would be to see children as a future workforce. So you have a future workforce which is all started joining even more than what it did. India has one third of the working children in the entire world. Is now you have an even larger proportion, and with the closure of the midday meals, with the closure of ICDS, except in maybe 2 or 3 states where food is actually delivered to the house, is you have a massive increase in undernutrition. And this has led not only to children working at many children of 4 and 3.5, now started helping whatever they could to be able to at least increase their income by a few rupees in a week or whatever. Is now you have another kind of an inequality which was there but which is much more stronger now, and that is an inequality based on nutrition levels. So with the non-distribution of the wheat and the rice which is just rotting in our go downs, the non-distribution of that, the non-universalization of the public distribution system, something which the right to food in the constitution really guarantees. You have another kind of an inequality which is reinforced in the informal labor market, and that is an inequality based on nutrition levels. So if you are physically stronger, you may be able to work for 10 hours for your 15 or 20 rupees, but if you're physically weak, you cannot even do that. So that is a new area, I think, which we really need to talk about. Now, I don't know how much time I have left. 10 minutes? How
Yes,
much time?
yes, I would say about 7 to 8 minutes. Yes.
Okay, now I just want to add on this, and I have never seen anything which is more cynical and something which needs to be opposed at every single level, whether it's economists or sociologists or at any absolutely any kind of a level, is that under the cover of COVID, under the cover of managing the pandemic, a whole lot of changes have been pushed through. Of course, the farm bills, which we know the kind of impact it's going to have. I'm not talking of the procedure. That is a different kind of an issue, which of course one needs to discuss at a lower level. But something which we have been fighting against for 3 years has been pushed and cleared and being implemented. And that is the huge changes which are coming in so-called labor reforms. Now, reforms, I'm putting it in quotes, the introduction of the labor codes, not only the introduction of the labor codes, but also 12 other states, 12 states which have changed the labor laws even as they exist. You have your list. When we talk about informalization, you take the definition of worker under the code on wages, the first code which was passed, and subsequently in the later codes also. By definition, there are a large number of categories of workers who are now not defined as workers. So, whatever minimal level of labor legislation applied to them is being totally withdrawn. What the labor code says is that a worker is one who is in an employee employer relationship in the public sphere, in the industrial sphere. So, what it leaves out, totally out of definition, is home based workers. All home based workers are now not defined as workers. Your BD workers, your Zari, petticoat, etc., etc. And also, what has been left out is where a large number of women work, and that is the domestic workers. They are not now recognized as workers at all. So, in fact, what you have is uh, a invisibilization of course. I'm not talking of invisibilization of work, but invisibilization of what were hitherto defined as workers. Now, what impact is going to have? I think it's something which is already manifesting itself in many kinds of ways. Added to this is the other kinds of reforms, so called, and please note, the labor codes say very clearly that this is the changes in the labor structure or the rights of workers is to improve ease of doing business. Now, this goes against the very definition of labor. Labor rights are to protect the rights of workers and not to protect the rights of capital or those who employ them. So therefore, in these 8 to 12, and I'm glad the Supreme Court has cut down at least one of the states, that is Gujarat, day before yesterday, because what these 10 states have done, 12 states, I'm very sorry to say, what they have done is they have increased the working day against the Constitution of India and against every international and national covenant, that the working day is now from 8 hours, it has been increased to 10 hours, and under conditions of emergency, in quotes. What this emergency is for production is a different issue, that the working hour can be extended to 16. That is double the number of what is internationally accepted. There are, of course, other, and this is carried out for what is called, it's to be done for 1,000 days. Okay, that's 3 years. No minimum wages guarantee, no minimum hours of work, and no creches to be provided, no toilet facilities to provided. And I think the most anti-human, I won't even say inhuman, it's anti-human, is that water will not be provided to workers in these 12 states. I cannot understand to what depth anybody can go to hurt your own citizens. There is, of course, a huge increase in unpaid work. It is not only, the work from home, which is a different kind of a category, but the massive increase in unpaid work of women. This we know is a major constraint for increasing women's work participation rate. India has one of the three lowest in the world. It's about it barely in its 20s, declining over a period of time, and this has increased very, very much so. And it has increased because of the policy changes which have been coming for a period of time, and also which are implemented now because of the lack of a proper, pro women, pro people, whatever one may want to call it, pandemic policy. So day before yesterday, the gas scheme, which is the Ujjwala scheme, has been withdrawn. And we know cooking energy and collecting fuel and firewood is one of the main tasks which women do, because they are responsible not only for production, but also for maintenance and for consumption of the household. Anganwadis have been closed. Creches, which were already a low number in, I think, about 5 years ago, was about 40,000, 38,000. In India, we're talking of entire India, the number of creches has come down this year, even before the pandemic, to 900 creches for working women in the entire country. 900. It just, mind just boggles at this. There is also, so therefore, when we talk about work, we talk about unpaid work, particularly where unpaid work is concerned, the entire switch which has been there, the entire context which has been there, and this started with the issue of the implementation of Swachh Bharat, or the building of toilets, and why are people not using toilets, etc., etc. And the entire responsibility is dumped on people, in the sense the use of behavioral economics in a very negative kind of a manner, that it is the people's responsibility. We talk about redistribution, we talk about recognition and redistribution of unpaid work. Now, this unpaid work, paid work is a whole different ball game. We can have a separate, 4-day kind of a discussion on this, on methodologies, etc., etc. But when we talk about redistribution of unpaid work, it's not within the household. It's not that if the husband and the wife shared the unpaid work, then everything would be perfectly fine and unpaid work would reduce. That is a behavioral economics perspective of it. The actual reality is that the redistribution of unpaid work, which constrains a large number of women and also men, I mean, these are field work studies which I have done, men are also constrained from joining the workforce to whatever extent it may exist because of the existence of unpaid work. And therefore, the resolution of redistribution of unpaid work has to come from the macro level. It is not at a micro level, it is at a macro level. There are many other issues which we can debate at a later stage, maybe in discussion, and I'm sure Dr. Dawar will be taking it up. The reduction in the age at marriage, any economic stress or a social stress reduces the age at marriage of girls. And this has come, I mean, very much in certain states in the south and many, many other areas. In fact, it's an all India kind of a phenomena, is that the age of marriage in certain areas has come down to 11 and 12. Now, please don't see age at marriage as a social issue, because what marriage means is the transfer of the labor of one economic worker to from one house to another house. So please see it in the context of economics and not only as a social component. There is also, of course, increase in maternal mortality rates, increase in infant mortality rates, uh, domestic violence, which has gone up very dramatically, education, skills, etc., etc. So, to conclude, there are many other aspects which I have left out, but which maybe we can just take up as discussion. Are that when we say there is the policy which is there, or the involvement of what is the state doing, what is the center doing. One, the states, many states are constrained, and they are constrained because of the non-distribution of GST and the cess, which again is against the constitution. They have been begging, they have been pleading. The only cess after the GST what they're allowed to increase on their own is petrol, which then of course increases your petrol and diesel, which increases your inflation levels very sharply, and of course alcohol, which again leads to various other kinds of issues. I'm not taking a moralistic stand, please, on this. The second is, when we say the government looks away, doesn't care, is not compassionate, etc., etc. This was, uh, I think I understood it in the words of a migrant worker. I was working with the migrant workers, and there were these planes which were coming in, April and May, what the Vande Bharat planes, bringing back NRIs from outside. And one worker points, he points to the sky and he says, "Dekho, NRI वापस आ रहे हैं." And this woman worker next to me, and she says, "We are also NRI." And I'm like, "Excuse me, what do you mean by saying you're NRI?" She said, "Non-required Indians." I don't think I will ever recover from that statement, but that's really what the entire issue of inclusivity, non-inclusivity, formal, informal is all about. That people are not required. Workers are not required at all. And so it's a deliberate, it's a conscious policy, it's a conscious political economy paradigm which is being followed. And I think we have to understand it at that level, and not keep hoping and praying that something is going to change, in the current dispensation and politics and economics. Thank you so much for this. Sorry if I've gone over time.
No, that's okay. I think this is very, very insightful, and we've gotten some very good feedback from the audience saying that they might not recover from this session. Especially the end when you said that, when you talked about the anecdote on the non-required Indians. Um, Thank you so much, Professor Devan, for giving us insights on not only the state of informal labor and gender inequalities, but also what really, really needs to change at the policy and the labor law level. Thank you so much. So now we would be taking forward the discussion with Dr. Bhargavi Dawar, who would be talking about the mental health of the informal laborer. Again, an issue that is a conversation that is barely existent in India. And she would be looking at it from how the current structure of the informal labor affects and ignores the mental health of the informal laborer, and tell us about how we can foreground gender and mental health into our policy discussions. Dr. Dawa, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jaya, for this opportunity. As somebody has marked in the chat, it's it's really there's nothing more to be said after Dr. Ritu's riveting presentation this morning. Thank you so much, ma'am. I've heard you speak before, and I'm really honored to be with you this morning. Really, I mean, the first thought that comes to me, of course, is, with so many people, I imagine a very big SDG mandala, with all the 16 promises made by the Indian government and governments in the Asia Pacific region. And as Ritu ma'am was speaking, I could see people just flying out of that mandala of the 16 SDGs and, dropping into like a dark space where there is nothing to hold them back, It's nothing to pull them into the mandala again. That's really the mental health population of the coming decade, I would say, 2020 to 20, 25, 30. And if it gets worse, of course, there will be more people popping out, and the Indian SDG mandala will be really emptied out, except for the few proverbial people who hold all capital with themselves. So that's the reality we are really looking at. Add to the dismal scenario, the recent debates about the Foreign Currency Regulation Act and the amendment, where they're saying that international NGO, which has an office in India, cannot further, give grants out. So the number of NGOs like Save the Children, HelpAge India, CPM, there are so many NGOs with offices here contributing to the most marginalized, those who are in remote areas, to reaching out to children, to people with disabilities, to women, to tribal areas. And you can see, even as I speak, that in the next 4 to 5 years, with the impact of the new foreign currency regulation, there will be like millions of people popping out of that SDG mandala. Well, it looks bleak. Coming back to this, I'm sorry, I'm not really very well versed in the money part of all of this. It's really been an eye opener, and I wish that I could give my time over to Dr. Ritu. But having committed to this program, I just want to say, ma'am, please carry on, take my time also. But I will say my little bit, and happy to actually leave a lot of this time for discussion. When the brief came to me from Jaya and Samyak, the question came to me like this: how does current structure of the informal labor economy in India affect the mental health of its workers? How much of these issues are a result of socio-economic exclusion? Now, I think this is a very interesting way of posing the question. Like I said, if you see all the people who are going to pop out of that mandala, of course, we're also including all the other sentient beings like animals, which will get killed while the big mega corporations come in to cut away the trees and start the mining and all of that. We're seeing a lot of that. And so there will be a lot of other beings also popping out of this mandala. But if you just look at the people who are leaving this so-called safeguard of the SDGs and government commitments to that, this is a very interesting way of posing the question. Like I said, those people who are popping out are stereotypical, classic textbook cases for mental health diagnosis. We saw that in the case of farmer suicides. We've seen a lot of that in the case of gender and mental health, where social justice issues are routinely diagnosed as medical conditions and treatment started. So that's been the scenario, at least ever since I started work on gender and mental health. We've always kind of challenged this idea that someone living in a really violent household, or a child who has been abused within the house by someone or the other, to take them to a psychiatrist or to a mental health professional to diagnose them with conditions that have no pathology whatsoever in the human body. Then to start treating them with drugs which will, take away whatever spirit that is there in their minds and bodies. This is really, like ma'am said, I mean, how low can a system get? How low can a system get? How much of cruelty are we capable of, inflicting on another human being, particularly women and children of the household who have. So we've raised this issue before. Let's not medicalize social issues. So I find this way of, qualifying the question very interesting. So you have the informal labor economy, and people are just bursting out of the seams of the SDG commitments, and so it affects their mental health. Do we have a situation here that mental health is really the result of socioeconomic exclusion? Of course it is. We are not asking, for example, and it continues to be asked in the literature, what is the prevalence of mental illness among the poor and the economically excluded? It is to ask in this way is the right beginning point, as we know how social discrimination and exclusion are the fermenting grounds for social distress, psychosocial distress, disturbance, and disability. Now, I think an interesting corollary to this interesting way of formulating the question is, supposing if all those people, who are in the Trishanku space and likely to be absorbed by the black hole, if they are slowly, given, threads of flower or threads, something, by which, or rafts perhaps, or some metaphorical thing by which they could be slowly brought back into the SDGs mandala. And imagine that one day in India, all these people are within this mandala of the SDGs. People in neighborhoods, in villages, in panchayats, in mountain areas, in the far-flung northeast, in every part of India, there is these very beautiful SDG rafts, and which brings people back into the SDG mandala. Imagine this world. It's not looking very near. It's not even looking very far, by the way. But supposing this happens due to some, magic bullet policy that the government brings up, and so will there be mental health issues? If everyone has a job, they have schools to go to, they have social protection, they have housing, they have food security, they have peaceful and just environments, they have access to justice. If they have all of this, do you think that they would be moving towards a point of overall well-being? What would be the reduction in psychosocial problems in neighborhoods and localities if all the SDG goals were met? And I think many of us who are working in communities have this vision somewhere, and we bring a message of hope all the time. We try to, until our hands and feet are once again cut, and you're like, okay, go back to square one. And this is an interesting question to ponder upon. That's really the beginnings of the Bapu Trust work. We've been trying to keep this hope alive that yes, the SDGs, we have committed to it. Whoever does it or not, we're going to do our bit, and who is this informal sector? Who are these people? What happens when you go to these people, who are, as you know, excluded economically and socially, and many times, of course, culturally as well, historically excluded peoples? Who are these people? And if you go to them with a traditional mental health package, what happens? They tried that in the farmers issue, farmers suicides. Let's go to them with a mental health package. Was that the need for the farmers? So when we began our work in the Pune Bastis about 20 years ago, we started in the abstract because one particular community-based organization kept coming back to us saying that we should address the mental health issues of people living in poverty in the slums of Pune. So quite out of ignorance, we started a mental health treatment clinic in a busy slum area of about 40,000 people. We offered psychotherapy and referral services to a medical setup. This is not unusual. I mean, even today, there are many community mental health programs in India, and for them, this would be a gold standard actually, that we even offered psychotherapy. Often, even that is not offered. So in the end, our experience after 4 years of this kind of work, of setting up a mental health clinic, treatment clinic, was that out of 40,000 people, and we expect that at least 20 to 25% of people along the mental health spectrum from stress and tension to disability would turn up here, 20 to 25 out of 40,000. Not even 40 people turned up at the clinic. By the end of the year, most of that 40 people, not 40%, but 40 people, they also had dropped out. So, and it was quite evident that we didn't know our community. Eventually, we closed the program and started to really try to see who these people were. We learned a lot out of this experience. It was like 2 to 4 years of knowing who these people were. Spaces in Pune city, and I guess this is true of most cities, they are divided into those who serve and those who are served. This is about the physical layout of a city like Pune. So there are people who serve and those who are not, those who serve and those who are served. It was interesting that 100% nearly of the low-income communities, that is the people who serve, were from the SC/ST communities or minority religious groups. They served in the commercial areas just flanking the periphery of the slums where they lived. This is why for people passing through in cars and bikes and all of that, the slums are invisible. They don't see that there are people living in these areas. Intersectionality of social discrimination and its very high co-occurrence with insecurity of housing, jobs, and so on. And I will not speak about this because we've had, like amazing worldview on this from Dr. Ritu. So we're not even working in migrant working communities. Like Bapu Trust is working in like settled income, low income areas of Pune, and settlers are here for 20 to 60 years or more. So let's not talk about, say, the construction workers colonies or the people who migrate to the periphery of the city to establish a livelihood, from the growing neighborhoods in the suburb areas. We work in like very well settled low income areas of Pune, and the settlers have been here for about 20 to 60 years or more. However, the expected upward mobility did not reach most of them. No social protections except the basic minimum through the PDS system and primary education. We've been working in these areas for 20 years. And we provide comprehensive psychosocial and inclusion services. The word inclusion, social inclusion, got added about 6 to 7 years ago after some periods of study and reflection on our earlier design for the services. So some learnings have been that providing a mental health service as a standalone strategy is never a beginning point. Social equality and inclusion issues then become converted into medical problems. And this is what we are saying. I think so that in the present scenario, when people are falling out of the SDG mandala, if you may put it like that, I mean, I'm sure that Dr. Ritu will have some challenges for me in describing it as a mandala, but the SDG mandala is a holistic view about what a society will look like and what choice will look like for people in various domains of life. And so it's a complete circle which holds everything together and hopefully nourishes people together. That was the vision of the SDGs, and that's what we committed ourselves to. But our learning has been that you have to bring that in to mental health. Can we think of housing as a mental health strategy? Can we think of work, employment as a mental health strategy? Can we think of completing education, particularly for girls who drop out of school for various reasons, particularly caregiving or violence at home, or other forms of abuse in the community. And we think of all of that as mental health strategies. So let's not think of mental health as a standalone strategy. It's never a beginning point. It's an easy option, and that's why people are going for that in India today. It's an easy option. So it's so much more difficult to look at social behaviors within a household to say, hey, maybe I should not raise my hand to beat up my wife. Maybe I should not build some trauma memories in the mind of my child. Who thinks like that anyway? And so this is the easier option, like, really? I mean, women get beaten. Let's go and see a psychiatrist. Why is it that you refuse to be beaten? And so this is more the attitude that we have in families and communities. And this happens a lot. I mean, we're shocked at the amount of violence that is prevalent today within households. Yeah, and so I want to say that example is, I think my colleagues are here as well today, so they might want to add at some point. There was a woman that was registered into our program. She was driven to several suicide attempts. There's domestic violence, alcohol in the family, all of that, the estranged children, all of that. So, and she kept saying that what she needed really was a proper house. She was like really, she was really someone with a very high support, psychosocial support need. She kept saying that all she needed was a house, and our team kept going back because we're not very comfortable doing housing for somebody, because we're supposed to be mental health professionals and we take great pride in that professional identity. But she kept saying that, yeah, I need my house. I don't know, just like, look at my house and look at my house, maybe something like that. And eventually, we insisted that she gets her house, and she did get her house. And there was people say that there was a magical transformation, of this woman, and there was also coming together of the family and support, after she got that house. Always there would be lingering psychosocial issues, but the point is that you can't say, first start your treatment, then we will correct your house. First start your treatment, then you can go and get employed. If that's the case, people, then all those people who are popping out of the SDGs mandala, you're not going to be able to catch them, because they have fallen off into some other spaces, and we don't want to know about that. The subject of suicide, I mean, it's like hot topic during these days, and it's very much the second border to the SDGs mandala boundary is the border on the question of life and death, is the question of survival. People are pushed to think like that. And so we really have to be quite serious about this. I mean, do you really want, we've got blood on our hands. I mean, the government has got blood on its hands because we are not addressing that second border, which is just outside the SDGs, Lakshman Rekha. And that's the question of life. And we saw that in the case of the migrants, walking back. We happened to work with some of the migrants who were gathered together in various shelters in Pune city. But that's, in fact, it's interesting that I mentioned suicide as the second boundary. We were called because we are the only, till today, I think there aren't many NGOs providing psychosocial services to people in low-income communities or people who are socially and economically excluded. I don't think so. There are very, very few services for the informal sector. And there are other reasons for that, which are market driven. We'll come to that in a bit. And the reason why we were called is because of the highly visible, red border right around the SDGs Lakshman Rekha. And so somebody committed suicide within a shelter, the migrants. And so people were like, okay, now we have to do something. So we were called by the local authorities, and so that's another story. I want to say that we don't wait for people to receive mental health treatment before we start sending out those rafts, sending out those, social protection packages, sending out those livelihood options, and we all have to act now. I mean, it's so difficult, under present circumstances where all the laws are being changed at the same time. Then what do we have to give even to people, because people are just taking out stuff. Corona is going on, people have lost jobs, and we are, like creating a new foundation, and those are graves for the people who are like left without any kind of prop or any kind of support to hold on to. So these foundational changes are very disturbing from a mental health point of view, and so yeah, so that's something that we really need to consider. And of course, economics. I'm really sorry that during my training days, I never focused a lot on this subject. So I'm so sorry that a lot of what I'm saying may not directly link to economics, but I guess you'll see the point that impoverishment is all around us, and it's just getting worse. I mean, I never imagined. I saw the migrants issue, and we also did some work on that. It's like not even a drop in an ocean. It's like 1/1,000,000th of a drop in an ocean. And we feel the same with respect to, we take great pride in the work that we do in the Bastis of Pune. We offer free services, psychosocial services for like a huge amount of population. But considering the humongous changes that are forthcoming in our community outside of the coronavirus, it gives a very bleak picture. Jay, how much time do I have?
We would like to wrap in about 2 to 3 minutes, if that's okay with you.
So productivity argument, can it create a spiral back into marginalization? And we just discussed the corollary question, how marginalization leads to mental health issues. Um, we must take a common sense view and try not to see mental health as a medical subject or an expert subject. People need jobs, and if they have a decent, dignified job, that will have a number of good effects on their self-esteem and overall well-being. This is a common sense view. They'll be able to provide and consume services and products that enhance their choice and fulfill their sense of satisfaction with life. I'm using the words provide and consume services and products quite consciously. We should stop seeing some populations as providers and some other populations as consumers. Everybody needs a job for the same reason, to be able to have an adequate standard of living and choice about various goods and services. Inclusion for persons with disabilities, for people with mental health issues, it has a cost. Economic questions have not, I mean, I really take this to heart, this whole issue of, what happens to people when they pop out of the SDG mandala. Outside the mandala, there is no economics, there's just a dark hole. And that happens a lot with people with disabilities, particularly people with mental health issues and psychosocial disabilities. The economic questions we've not reached that far. We don't have such a nuanced life, generally speaking, that we talk about economic questions impacting our lives. We are not in the market at all. And maybe some of us would yearn to be, I have known of so many peers who have gone through mental health issues, psychosocial disabilities, yearning for a phone because they are denied phone. We consider human rights to be more of a value base, but it has a cost. The link between the loss of human rights and productivity or contribution to society, I think we need to consider that. It's great that these days there are gender-based and disability-based budget analysis and few groups trying to influence the national budgeting process, I must say with very limited success. And what is that? What happens to people when they fall out of the net? India has a peculiarity with respect to some populations, persons with disabilities, persons seen to be of unsound mind, persons who are poor, vagrant, homeless, or pauper, people who are from certain tribes, people who are mendicants, fakirs, or renunciates. historically and through the colonial period, these populations were not considered as a legal person, leave alone as a economic person or a social person. They are not considered as a legal person, excluded from all kinds of citizenship rights. They could be arrested without warrant and incarcerated into various types of special institutions. You can immediately see that these are also the people who are not considered to be productive in the sense of free market economy. Always there has been a view of charity for them. Yes, they deserve food, some clothes, and a roof above their heads. Let's put them inside of institutions. Laws exist, institutions exist for this very purpose. Those who are not productive go into these places. They are very much in demand today for various reasons, which we will not go into just now. But point to note, a mental hospital is among this class of colonial institutions. The purpose for which they were built is very different from what we imagine them to be. However, human rights violations are a dime a dozen with respect to these institutions. People are slowly deprived of their right to life and livelihood, and once here, it's a place to die for many. So actually in my visualization today of the SDGs mandala and the second red boundary outside, which is a question about life and death, I see that second boundary, in my view, it is red in color, dotted with many kinds of institutions. When we started work about 20 years ago, there were about 40 public institutions. Today you have about 4,000, and day by day they are growing, they're all around. So that's where people end up. If they have survived the drop out of the safety net. It is paradoxical, in my introduction, Jaya said that I'm fighting for the right to live in the community independently. It is paradoxical that we have to call living in the community independently a human right. Isn't that also a piece of common sense? Isn't it something that we all take for granted? Yes, of course, we should live in the community. And why is that a human right? Why do we have to fight for it? Is there even a law about this? There is no law excepting today the disability law, which guarantees the right to live in the community, having choice, for example, in housing, and in terms of who a person wants to live with. We're very far from seeing this human right realized. However, we continue at a time when people are talking about traditional values, self-determination, all of that. In the way the society is crumbling and people are pushed outside of that safety net, how is this human right ever going to be realized? And so this is a really big question. There is the issue of privatization of healthcare, cost of buying any kind of mental health services. As far as I know, there's no service like the Seher program of the Bapu Trust in all of the country. People, if you have to reach out to a counselor, say in Bombay, Delhi or Pune, minimum cost is 3,000 per hour. So there is that. So I will stop here and look forward to some questions. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And thank you, Dr. Ritu, for that mind transforming presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dawa. That was quite insightful, and I think we did not only get to learn about. I think the point that you made about that mental health is not a standalone issue. It encompasses a lot of things is very pertinent, and also what needs to change in policy and at an institution level. So thank you so much for that talk. And we do have a bunch of interesting questions from our audience, which I would like to pose to the both of you. We will start with a question that we have from Afreen Faridi. He asks, isn't the notion of sustainability merely a tool of status quo, which does not envisage structural changes? Have there been any significant progresses using this policy tool? Anybody who would like to go first? Dr. Devan?
I think that's for you. That question is for Bhargavi.
Well, I will dovetail you, madam. It's been, it's like mental health follows you, We do talk about sustainable mental health, but
Oh
I think
no,
so. Yeah. So after you, please.
No, I think because you raised a sustainable development issue, so that's why I was saying that you say it first. One second. But for me, the SDGs are actually a bit of platitudes, you know. I mean, it's like a wish list, which all of us agree with. But the point is, does the situation permit you to fulfill any of those SDGs, you know? And so there are, you know, one or two aspects, particularly where gender is concerned, and even otherwise. And it says that yes, there should be equality. I'm just giving you one example: equality in access to control of resources and land and forests, etc. And you know, gender equality, etc. And it says as nationally appropriate. Now, this is something which the Indian government fought for. So, what is nationally appropriate? Please link it up to what is the definition of a nation today, and whether equality is guaranteed by law in resources. Your Inheritance Act, which came only a few years ago, there is no inequality in terms of say same-sex marriage. That's not nationally appropriate in quotes according to the Indian state. So sustainability has to be seen in a concrete lived reality, a legal reality, a social reality. That's what I would say. Bhargavi.
Thank you, ma'am. So I think so that there is uh, our questions have become far more challenging on sustainability issues.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
what is sustainable today, is just
Yeah.
beyond our ken. We don't even have the data, of the events of the last couple of years. Because we're all so fragmented today. We're just trying to catch up with things, and then more things happen. And somewhere we have to gather what little we have and come into a process of international advocacy. I think so that the SDGs also obligate governments to go into a certain kind of international process, and it is possible to influence that. And today, with the global digitalization of all communications, the live and transparent ways in which the global systems work, I think that we need to get our voices in there. We need to get our voices on continuing basis with the national government. They have listened to some areas. They have not listened to many areas, but I think so it is possible to influence. So many of us must become influencers. And I'm not talking about, co-optation or cooperation. I'm just talking about influencing. And I think we need to get that data together and keep, putting it forward. And I think this is so important because it is an obligation by the government. And the government has not said that we will not oblige, we will not take the steps. We will take the steps. They have said this in public international forums. And we have to hold them to that commitment. We have to hold them to that commitment. Yeah.
Yeah, data is just so important and so basic because, you know, and it's a right. It's a right of every citizen to have data. But for me, you know, data now in the past few years has become what I call an urban Naxal. You know, it's to be locked up, it's tied, there'll be no bail given to it, it's not going to be released, there's going to be no case heard for it. You have your, you know, your PLF, your labor force data, your so much of information which should have been collected and which is not being collected and not being distributed. It was only, I think, that leaked report which we had on the PLF, that labor force participation rate. Otherwise, there's no information available at all. So the issue of data is very essential, and the issue, like Bhargavi said, of pressurizing for it. They may not listen to us. Right now, there's nobody to listen to us. Nobody listens to us in the, I mean, but I think strength, people listen to strength. They may not listen to individuals, but they do listen to collective strength and solidarity, very much so.
I think yes, definitely like collective strength and solidarity is what we need to go for to make our voices heard. We have another question, which is how can policies address the issue of inaccessibility to people like sex workers and transgenders, over which Professor Diwan particularly talked of, and with people and on people with psychosocial disabilities, for which Professor Dawar has talked about. So if we could start with Professor Diwan on this question, and then Professor Dawar could take over.
For me, the issue is when we talk of formal, informal, we talk about those who are not getting minimum wages, those who are getting minimum wages. We talk about, whether you're a woman or a man or a transgender sex worker. For me, there's only one resolution as of now, and that is the universalization of everything. Universalization of food, universalization of education, universalization of work at every single level. So therefore, things like one nation, one ration card, etc., is just not acceptable. It's just not acceptable, because if you see migrants where they are concerned, a male migrant, when he migrates, and the majority migrate without their families because this has to be someone at home, etc., is they do not carry their ration cards with them. And why should they? We are citizens of a country. We are a republic, and I think we should really claim the public in the republic, and demand you. This is a struggle which has gone on for years, and we have attained. We have the Food Security Act, we have everything. The point is whether it can be implemented or not implemented. And universalization, uh, accessible, affordable. And that, I think, one issue which Bhargavi has raised is very important, and that is the issue of health. Health is the greatest one single reason why people fall into poverty. And what the pandemic policy has done, because what is a lockdown or a lockup, whatever, it's a period to strengthen your health infrastructure. And that is something which has not been done at all. You, as an economist, you all please see the health allocation of the center and expenditure. Forget the allocation, the expenditure. It has actually fallen in April, May, and June, when it should have gone up some maybe 10 times. So for me, there's no debate. Universalization, your social security, your pension, at every single level, it has to be done. And there are enough resources. Economists say they're not enough. There are more than enough resources which are available in the center. I'm not talking about the PM care or whatever that we know. There are enough resources in the sense, just day before yesterday, 860 crores have grenades have been bought. Grenades to use against your own people. I mean, it's really unbelievable. 8,500 worth of special wide-bodied planes for the president and the prime minister to travel in. 8,500 crores. And of course, your grandiose new rebuilding of the parliament, 20,000 crores now, a final cost of 65,000 crores, which are there. And it also brings into account what is the kind of political, judicial structure which we are facing today. We talk about the pillars of democracy, etc. To where really are they going? I have filed, along with 4 other people, a case in the Supreme Court in January against the parliament building construction, that India cannot afford that money, and various other kinds. We haven't got a hearing. In 10 months, we haven't had a hearing. So it's you talk, you demand, who is there to hear? And therefore, the issue of collectivity. I've gone beyond the question, but for me, all this is the political paradigm of rule, you know, of economic rule and a political rule, which is something which is so essential to debate.
Dr. Dawar, if you could, if you have something to add, especially on the psychosocial disabilities part of
Yeah.
the question.
Um, well, I'm a bit confused about the issue of inaccessibility. Are we talking about the inaccessibility of various services, or what is that, or economic inaccessibility?
I believe in the perspective of mental health, we are more inclined towards talking about inaccessibility in terms of the services
So
and how the
mental
current
health.
yes, and how the current economic structure fails to make it accessible and inclusive for the marginalized communities.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm not sure if that is a good thing or a bad thing that people are not able to access the traditional mental health care services because, like I said, most of them are institution based. We have a national mental health policy which was refurbished, I believe so, in the middle of this particular decade. And in response to the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But as far as I know, no money has been, tagged to that policy. And largely, there has been a privatization of healthcare and mental health care. So it's really, really difficult for people, in the informal sector to be able to access those services. So it's like really, there is not much really, Jaya, for people with psychosocial disabilities. And what we've done is really to put out a lot of information, just help yourself, help each other. Self-determination is the key, to good mental health for yourself. So when our own model of community support is built around, enabling a person to own and embrace their own mental well-being. We do this in a number of ways, and I miss this point on malnutrition, food scarcity, food security, and malnutrition. It's going to have huge impact on people, in the informal sector. They've been deprived of food for months now, and the PDS system is crumbled. Anyway, you never got much out of that system, which is healthy. Children, I read a recent report by the World Health Organization talking a lot about, corona on one side, but malnutrition among children, stunted growth, all the traditional problems which you thought that you had gotten over in public health, the alma ata and maternal and child head, all of that. It's like there is a resurgence of many of those issues, and of course it causes great deficiency in mental well-being. So there is all of that. Actually, there is, I don't know what to say because how can policies address? There are policies, but like I said, no budgets are tagged to them, never been implemented, and so I really have very little answer to that. There are a few of us who are working, serving communities, but that's so few. And the tsunami of exclusion is right in front of us. So to me, it looks bleak.
Thank you for answering that. We have, I think we have time to take two more questions.
I just want to add
Yes, sure.
I just want to add something to what Bhargavi was saying. You know, the issue of in accessibility, etc., etc. I think what she's raised is something which is so very important. But just to give you one example of what of the pandemic policy, how to make things inaccessible, even when you talk about giving, and that is this 1,500 rupees, which was promised as old age pension for women and for the disabled. Okay, what they call the uplang, that was the scheme which was there. And that 1,500 rupees was not given at one time. It was distributed over 3 months. So every month, the disabled or the physically challenged person and that old woman had to travel to collect 500 rupees. Now, the policy design, even 1500 is pathetic, but give it at one go. Now, with the closure of transport and nothing available, these people had to spend 200 rupees to travel to the taluka and the district headquarters to collect 500 rupees. So, I can't think of a more perfect example of inaccessibility in policy terms. Okay, I'm not talking of affordable and nearness and access, etc. That's a different kind of thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We have one interesting question, which is on. It's always brought up that the solution to social issues is better development or expansion of the formal sector. Capital, supply side interventions like housing, education, they dominate the field. Is this really the solution for the informal sector?
No,
Um,
that, sorry.
no. Please go ahead. Yes.
No, I first of all, I think we should stop seeing things as formal and informal. Honestly, I really believe that, and see people as people, irrespective of whether they're in the formal sector or the informal sector. Give housing, affordable housing, everybody. Education, it's there in the constitution, the right to education. We have fought for this, we have got this. So provide it to absolutely everybody. Your social security, your health, all the social security legislations which are there, your protection, your pension, should be applicable to just everybody. Those who get it in the formal sector are very, very few. I think they are hardly a few percentage, because now even in the formal sector, you have at least 80% on contract basis who do not get health insurance or get anything at all. And therefore, the issue then becomes, again, like I said, universalization of absolutely everything. But this, of course, now is a problem, as Bhargavi pointed out, with a huge privatization which is existing and which is being pushed forward at many levels. I mean, you take the example of Kerala at the airport, and the state government wants to run the airport because it is a profit making airport. But the center government has sold it to a private company. And so the Kerala government has to actually go to court and say, leave our asset, our profit making asset with us. So universalization of everything without differentiation is for me the only answer.
Dr. Dawar, if you would like to add something to that.
No, I'm fine. Thanks.
And we have one last question, which I think makes for a perfect closing question as well. We would like to ask you, what gives you hope?
For me,
Well,
people give the hope. I mean, we were all in a state of despair till I remember the anti-CA movement. I mean, the way the country erupted on that was really something. And I think it's something which is happening today. I, people give the hope. Absolutely, there's nothing else.
um,
And Dr. Dawar, if you,
Yeah, well,
what
mental
gives you-
health. Yeah, mental health is a subject area, and I myself have, had very excruciating experiences in my life, and my constant endeavor through the many years of living a life has been to retrieve hope again and again. And I think this is so important. I do believe in local communities, possibility of coming together, and talking about these issues. I think so. If we have the opportunity to come together and talk about these issues and take some steps at the local level, then we can find some solutions, which may not be, universal. And don't know, because today you've got me in a kind of a hopeless moment, because there have been so many things happening in law and policy, and it's all like it's just been dumped on our heads and say, okay, let me shake that off and think what solutions. It's been difficult times. But I do, having worked in communities for the last, I don't know, many years, and having worked closely with many people and families in those communities for a long time, I do see that, at the top, there are, of a flowing river, there are some waves and there are ripples, and, the fish are caught by the birds, and, there are things moving and predating and all of that. But at the bottom of the river, there is calm. And the community is like that. And for me, I think that's what I would focus on, because it always brings back hope. We have been through times like this many a times in the history of the Bapu Trust.
Yeah.
And it's a good time to, I see fish in the ponds. When there is too much ripple on top, they dive under, and they form their own little closed community space. And I hope so for the world, for India, definitely in many parts of India, which are now getting scrambled, by the ripples on top. I hope so they will all come together and support each other until this passes. That's my wish for India today.
Really,
Thank you.
very, very nicely put. And I just want to add a qualifier to when I said the faith in people. Of course, one's feeling numb and upset and etc. at whatever is happening. But also, what gives a lot of courage is, of course, people coming together. But and I think more than anything else is students. During the emergency, when we were students, I think we were a huge reason for why the emergency went. And I think again, it's only students who, get together and do whatever they have to do to bring things to some kind of a humane passage. Human and humane.
I think,
Well,
yes.
yeah, let's just hope. Sorry, I can't help making this quip that, let's not say this too loudly, otherwise we will have a students regulation law very soon.
Well, digital media also, all Zoom is being done. That's okay. We won't allow it to happen. Students, please listen.
Okay, I believe that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I think that was, first of all, I think Professor Dr. Dava, that was a beautiful analogy. Thank you so much for that. And yes, that was a great closing on how I think faith in people and community coming together is the only way forward to change. Thank you so much, Dr. Devan and Dr. Davar. This was really, really insightful. Like I already said, we have gotten feedback from the audience saying that they might not recover from this session. And I think that is what is necessary to be that impactful. That I think we have been able to really push people to think. So thank you so much for letting us know about this, not only the state of the informal labor economy from a gender and a mental health perspective, but also telling us what we can do at an individual level to change it, and also what needs to change at a larger policy level. And just on the closing, actually extending from the whole community needs to come together for change. If in the audience, if you would like to join us at the Rethinknomics India Network, because this is what we want to do and this is what we are aiming to do and trying to do. So if you would like to get involved with us, we have we have put links in the chat, so you can join us as a volunteer. You can also start your own local group at your university. And do follow us on our social media handles. We have on Instagram, Twitter. We will also be putting up the recording of this session on our YouTube handle, sharing it all with the members. And just a shout out, we have two interesting events lined up as well, so for you to stay tuned. One is on how we can engage academics to bring about change within the discipline of economics, which we have planned for some time in the coming few weeks. And another one, we have a workshop and a speaker session planned for inequalities and welfare in India. which would be looking at it. We want to look at it from an academic and again in a policy perspective. So just a shout out. Stay tuned. You can follow us on our social media for all the updates. We had a lot of other questions which we were not able to take. So if Dr. Diwan, Dr. Davar, if you have a handle that people can reach out to or something like that, and if you could tell us if there's a way that people could reach out to, that would be great. Otherwise, we can close. Thank you everyone for joining. Yes, this was great. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Davar.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.